Edgar Allan Poe was a literary leader and icon that drew from his emotional and horrific past to create masterpieces. He was an emergent of the genre of the detective story and was an influential horror and macabre poet. He was the first to use delayed recognition in his mystery books.
He left a legacy that allows creative thinkers to thrive. Authors and horror movie directors alike can look to Poe for inspiration. He influenced legends like Arthur Conan Doyle and modern-day producers of television shows such as The Simpsons and Sabrina the Teenage Witch.
He helped put American literature on the map. So before him, there were famous American writers overseas like Washington Irving, James Skinner Cooper, but they're kind of dismissed by European readers as kind of imitators of the British, and they're still provincial. But Poe is the first American writer who was really influential, who changed the shape of European literature and made new traditions over there, invented new literary genres. So he sort of signaled America's literary independence. And he's the one who really broke free of European traditions and started new ones and inspired European writers.
The fact that so many of the women that he was closest to died very young seemed to have quite an influence on his body of work.
Elizabeth Poe, Edgar Allan's biological mother, died at age 23 of tuberculosis, only 2 years after Edgar was born.
The Allans, a wealthy family in Richmond, Virginia, raised him. Frances Allan, in particular, grew very fond of Edgar, and she became the first matriarchal figure in his life due to the fact that he never knew Elizabeth Poe. Frances died of tuberculosis as well at age 44.
Virginia Clem was Edgar Allan Poe's first wife and first cousin. She was wed to Poe at age 13 while Edgar was 27. She also died of tuberculosis at age 24 in their family cottage in the Bronx.
She needed to care for Virginia Clem, and especially after her illness, he had to sell a lot, so he really turned to writing short fiction, which sold best in the magazines, wrote a lot of nonfiction articles, and didn't write quite as much poetry during that middle period of his career. But that is fortunately when he wrote a lot of his best short stories, like The Fall of House Flusher and William Wilson and The Telltale Heart. And a lot of that's because of the market and because of his need to survive from his writing.
These tragedies of Poe's loved ones influenced the creation of his famous poems Annabel Lee, Lenore, and The Raven.
And my soul, from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor, shall be lifted nevermore.
It seems like The Raven gets the most amount of attention. For instance, influencing the name of a football team. How many poems, have ever influenced the name of any kind of athletic team, for one.
Also, the only poem that most adults in America can quote. If you ask the average adult, they can usually quote at least The Raven, Nevermore, or Once Upon a Midnight Dreary. There's not a lot of poems, especially poems from that time period, that a lot of Americans remember.
H.P. Lovecraft, most famously known for horror and macabre, used Poe's work as a model for his writing.
In a letter written to J. Vernon Shea on the 19th of June in 1941, H.P. Lovecraft wrote, "Poe has probably influenced me more than any other one person. If I have ever been able to approximate his kind of thrill, it is only because he himself paved the way by creating a whole atmosphere and method which lesser men can follow with relative ease."
In a separate letter to Clark Ashton Smith on November 18, 1930, H.P. Lovecraft wrote, "Since Poe affected me most of all horror writers, I can never feel that a tale starts out right unless it has something of his manner. I could never plunge into a thing abruptly as the popular writers do."
Correspondingly to the producers of The Raven, Arthur Conan Doyle was influenced by Edgar's creation of the detective story.
Sherlock Holmes is based on Auguste Dupin, the detective that Edgar Allan Poe created. But also the way that Arthur Conan Doyle discovered stories is kind of similar to how I can think of at least one instance, the way that Poe could come across a story. Like, there's a mystery story called The Mystery of Mary Roget, another detective story. And in fact, it even has that same detective, Auguste Dupin. And what inspired Poe to come up with this idea was an actual newspaper article about a real murder, and that influenced his writing this story. And Arthur Conan Doyle used to do the same thing. Like, he would read about real-life murder mysteries in the newspapers, and that would influence him.
These are things that Arthur Conan Doyle and later detective writers have emulated, but really developed, crystallized that detective character, and even his sidekick that follows him around, kind of like Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson, or Freddy and Scooby-Doo, or Adrian, Monk and Natalie, or Psyche and Gus. It all goes back to Poe.
Why I think this is one of his greatest accomplishments is, with innovating this genre, is that, he was really essentially creating it all his own. You look like prior to, Murders in the Rue Morgue or The Purloined Letter, which is another story that's considered a detective story, and you don't really see any kind of solid model from what he was going from, or being influenced from.
He designs his best horror fiction, his best tales of terror, in such a way that they're almost like a mousetrap. It's designed to spring at just the right point, so every element has to fit together just perfectly, so when you spring that trap, you get that impact he's trying to achieve.
In Poe's Dupin stories, it's not just the protagonist who is trying to figure out who the culprit is. It's also us, the readers. Anything in the story, no matter how minor, could be evidence of who committed the crime, and we're supposed to use our deductive reasoning to figure out what the answer has to be. He led the way for other authors to write more stories in the genre that he created, called detective stories. This genre was also known as delayed recognition mysteries.
Poe's past influenced his pieces such as The Raven, which in turn motivated other creative minds such as Arthur Conan Doyle and H.P. Lovecraft. His groundbreaking creativity not only inspired authors, but it also laid the foundation for producers in pop culture today.
You're referring to one of my stories, a work of fiction.
I'm afraid I am not.
Look!
Where am I? What is this place?
It's him! It's Edgar Allan Poe!
Hilda, I'd like you to meet Mr. Poe.
It's such a pleasure to meet you.
Thanks for the ride.
That voice, it's so scary. May I take your cape?
No garment could be scarier.
This is the stuff of nightmares.